from around the country were vigiling and nonviolently acting to remember the dark dawn of the nuclear age and to resist the ongoing arms race today. In Washington, D.C. last week, folks from Jonah House and Dorothy Day Catholic Worker and elsewhere used Dan Berrigan's sober poem to reflect on how our collective past, present, and future lie in the shadow of weapons of mass destruction.
This is Shadow on the Rock by Daniel Berrigan. At Hiroshima, there's a museum, and outside that museum, there is a rock. And on that rock, there's a shadow. That shadow is all that remains of the human beings who stood there on August 6, 1945, when the nuclear age began. In the most real sense of the word, that is the choice before us. We shall either end war and the nuclear arms race now, in this generation, or we will become shadows on the rock.
So let that be an invocation for this 2-hour community webinar on the life and witness of Ladon Sheats. 30 years ago, I had the opportunity to visit both Hiroshima and Nagasaki on their respective anniversaries as part of a delegation representing indigenous peoples who were resisting militarization in the Pacific Basin. During that trip, I encountered this great outpouring of civic commitment to peace, one of the most remarkable things I've ever witnessed. Here on the slide shown is the annual release of doves in front of the Hiroshima Memorial Plaza. The Hiroshima Nagasaki commemorations have, for many radical Christians, become kind of anti-feast days. That is, a time in which we are called to wrestle with the profound disfiguration of humanity by modern warfare in 1945 and still today in 2012. But helping us through the dark commemoration of disfiguration is the old church's great feast of light, the Feast of the Transfiguration, also on August 6th. On this day we recall the Jesus who, at a crucial turning point in his ministry, went up a high mountain to commune with the spirits of Moses and Elijah. We find that story in Mark chapter 9. Now, ancient tradition identifies the Mount of Transfiguration as Mount Tabor, southeast of Nazareth, a prominent landmark in Galilee. In the Hebrew Bible, Mount Tabor was the staging area for the guerrilla leaders Deborah and Barak and their vastly outnumbered forces, who defeated a heavily armed professional Canaanite army, which the biblical writer attributes to the intervention of Yahweh. We find that story in Judges 4 and 6. In the gospel story, however, Jesus ascends this mountain as he is about to commence his march to Jerusalem in order to non-violently face down the powers. Jesus goes to this sacred place to draw strength from his ancestors. He gains strength for the difficult journey ahead. Like Elijah on the mountaintop, Jesus is called back to the metropolitan heart of darkness to try to liberate humanity from its disfiguration by violence. It is to the ancient wisdom of the great wilderness prophets that the disciples of Mark's story, and we, its readers as well, are instructed to listen. This is a wisdom that Ladon Sheats heeded intensely. So we begin this community webinar with this brief acknowledgement of last week's commemoration of disfiguration and transfiguration, because I think Ladon would want us to. he chose, after all, to pass into the cloud of witnesses early on the morning of August 7th, 10 years ago last week. For those of us who loved him, this has since made the August 6th to 9th season a sort of triduum of remembrance, of disfiguration and transfiguration. Most importantly, we begin this way because Ladon was someone who felt the weight of both disfiguration and transfiguration profoundly in his spirit. He lived his discipleship in that difficult space between his own mystical relationship with God, while also having fully grasped that our civilization has backed itself into a historic dead end, and our way of life has been unmasked as Derek Jensen rightly calls it, an end game. It is Ladon's extraordinary life and witness between the ecstasy of transfiguration and the trauma of disfiguration that is the focus of this community webinar tonight. Now, for those of you who did not know Ladon, do you want to scroll down and see if they're on yet? I just want to briefly explain how tonight's conversation is congruent with our monthly BCM webinar series that normally focuses on a text of Scripture and the context of a contemporary social justice issue. Tonight we're engaged in an exercise of what my teacher Jim McClendon, who also knew Ladon, called biography as theology. As McClendon put it in a book by that name, Christian beliefs are not so many propositions to be cataloged or juggled like truth functions in a computer, but they are living convictions which give shape to actual lives and actual communities. The only relevant critical examination of Christian beliefs may be one which begins by attending to lived lives. Theology must be at least biography, and biography at its best will be theology. He's on. Welcome, Jeff Dietrich. We see you. We cannot hear you yet, but we'll get to that, so be patient. We're very glad you're here. You want to go tell Tim he's on? Over the past few months, Elaine and I have been discussing with Dennis and Tensie how to commemorate this 10th anniversary of Ladon's passing. In particular, we're increasingly concerned to begin capturing the stories of Ladon's life and witness in order to preserve them for the next generation. We considered trying to move around the country with a video camera to interview many of his friends, many of you who are on this call, and colleagues, or perhaps hosting regional gatherings for the same purpose. But the more we thought about it, the more both options, we realized that these options demanded more time and money than we can afford. So we decided to pursue this experiment of a community webinar. Our hope is that it will enable our very scattered kindred community to meet and tell stories about Ladon with no carbon footprint, which I think Ladon would at least approve of that part of it. This medium also has the advantage of automatically recording this program, particularly since Tim reminded me to record it. And the idea is that this will be archived so that anybody can access it in the future, and even hopefully perhaps we can add to some of the testimonies. So that's what this is all about. And I want to emphasize by way of preface that biography as theology is a necessarily very personal exercise. I know that I shed a lot of tears preparing for this webinar this week. And everybody who's going to share about Ladon tonight had deep friendships with him. I met Ladon at a discipleship weekend in the Bay Area in mid-January 1976. It was one of those encounters that changed the course of my life. Through Ladon and the reading of the Sermon on the Mount that he offered, I felt called to a discipleship journey that continues to this day. Just a few months later, I hitchhiked across the country to join Ladon at Jonah House in Baltimore, where he invited me to share his small room on the 3rd floor of that community. And what an extraordinary gesture that was for Ladon, the introvert, to share the only space of refuge he had with a clueless 21-year-old Californian. It impacted my life permanently, and I think everybody will say the same. This amazing offer of hospitality. No lesser language will do. Ladon's time and attention changed me forever. And I think each of those you will hear from tonight will say the same thing, as would countless others, including many who met Ladon only once or twice. So tonight we're reflecting on Ladon's life through the lens of these very personal relationships, as well as through the lens of our shared public vocation. We have several folks who have volunteered to share about Ladon. They're pictured up top, and they're going to share at relevant points as I try to string it together in a brief thumbnail sketch of Ladon's life. Together we will offer only glimpses of Ladon's life and witness, but we hope this won't be the last time we do this, so that over the course of time we can build an archive of stories that will keep his memory a living one. Do you know whether Morris is on here? No. Now, Ladon was born in 1934 in Brownfield, Texas, the middle of 3 sons. And we were hoping at this point that one of his brothers, Morris, who's pictured here, would be on this call. We sent him the link, and we're hoping that, and we have talked to him, and we're hoping he will figure out a way to get on. He's not on, to our knowledge, at present. Morris is a retired pastor and leadership development coach living in Texas, and we do hope that he can be on this webinar representing the family, though he chose to listen rather than to share. Their father, Homer, was an Assemblies of God preacher who pulled cotton by day and built churches by night among the hard-scrabble towns of West Texas. How do you like that picture, Tensie? Pretty nice, huh? Had to search for that one. Their mother, with whom he was exceptionally close, and Dennis and Tensie, we couldn't remember Ladon's mom's name, so maybe you could text it in the chat function. She worked equally hard and faithfully through those years. Church was their whole life as a family, and Ladon would occasionally spin stories about growing up that were both poignant and hilarious. During the 1950s, Ladon completed a stint in the Air Force and a business degree from Texas Tech. It is important for us to recall that this era was a deeply contradicted one. On one hand, the post-war economic boom brought widespread prosperity to middle-class white folks across America. On the other hand, it was the height of the Cold War, and American optimism labored under the long shadow of a nuclear cloud and the brinksmanship of hostility. These factors impacted everybody, not least the young Ladon. Ladon began working for IBM, and by the mid-1960s had become a top executive. In this era of the first great computer technology boom, Ladon came to live large, keeping offices and homes on both coasts, eating at the best restaurants, and vacationing all over the world. And in a minute, Don Mosley may have a story or two to tell us from that era. And yet, Ladon was spiritually uneasy. He thirsted for the faith of his childhood to come alive again, and for the gospel to mean more than it did to most American middle-class Christians. Such contradictions made the disintegration and disillusionment of the 1960s inevitable. The American dream began unraveling in a swirl of decolonization struggles abroad and anti-war protests, civil rights dissent, and urban riots at home. Like everyone else in his generation, Ladon was deeply impacted by the Vietnam War. But he didn't know how to reconcile his conscience, his job, and the turbulent times. At the same time, Ladon was being impacted by the work of Young Life's Bill Milliken on the Lower East Side of New York City, and issues of racial justice and poverty were causing Ladon to question the foundations of his own consciousness. It was a 1967 meeting, however, with Baptist activist and theologian Clarence Jordan that singularly disrupted Ladon's upward mobility and led to a dramatic about-face. We're about to come to the video. Ladon was radically inspired and challenged by Clarence's exposition of the way of Jesus in the Gospels, which in turn animated Clarence's practical experiments with interracial farming communities among the rural poor of South Georgia. Because Clarence was so instrumental in Ladon's life, and because, as Steve Clemens just reminded me this week, we are this year commemorating the 100th year of Clarence's birth, we want to pause here and play a 4-minute YouTube video that gives us a little bit of a glimpse of the extraordinary witness of Koinonia Farms in the 1940s and 50s. And you who are participating will want to turn your volumes up loud so you can hear and see this video. We do want to note that also on YouTube is a 45-minute audio history of Koinonia made by Clarence. It's a talk that Clarence gave in 1956 at a particularly critical time in Koinonia's life, and that's on YouTube. And I also want to let you know that thanks. Also want to let you know that there's a great book out on Clarence Jordan, edited by Joyce Holliday, called Clarence Jordan Essential Writings. It's a 2009 Orbis Press book, and that's available as well. In a later interview, Ladon talked about the throes of his doubts after meeting Clarence. It was January 1969 before I left my job as a business executive. As I thought about being with Clarence for a few hours, I felt a lot of joy and more than a little apprehension. With LaGuardia Airport's snarl of traffic behind us, I plunged into conversation. You know, Clarence, I've been thinking a lot about the kind of discipleship you taught us last August, and I'm really troubled. My life is so complicated today. Sure wish things were as simple as leaving your nets. I don't know, Ladon, Clarence drawled. I guess old Rock and Andy found it as hard to leave their jobs as you would to leave IBM. Rationalizations unmasked, I glanced over. We exchanged grins, and I changed the subject. Finally, after an agonizing period of discernment, Ladon divested himself of his wealth and went to live at Koinonia Partners in Americus, Georgia. Tragically, Clarence died just a few months later. But from that time on, Ladon became a living witness to and interpreter of Clarence's vision of radical discipleship to many of us around the country. Another witness to and translator of Clarence's vision is Don Mosley, and he's well suited to share about those ideas with Ladon at Koinonia. Don currently lives and works with Jubilee Partners in Comer, Georgia, northeast of Atlanta, a community that is itself a spin-off from Koinonia. Don worked with Ladon in Americus in the late 1960s and early 70s. Indeed, he met Ladon in 1961. Don, welcome to the webinar. Now you have to re-enable your microphone. Don, you're going to need to re-enable your microphone there. Unmute your microphone, Don. There you go. There you go.
Are we on now?
Yep. Yep.
Well, It is, to say the very least, a real honor to be here remembering our brother Ladon. And it blows my mind to realize that it was 51 years ago this month that my teenage sister twisted my arm and got me to take her from Waco up to Dallas and Fort Worth area to Bedford Ranch to a church retreat. I didn't want to go. I was lukewarm at best. But when we arrived there, I still remember this guy loping down the sidewalk to greet us with a big smile on his face. "Hi, I'm Ladon Sheats." And my life was never the same again. Something clicked, and we spent literally scores of weekends together over the next few years. Mostly in Dallas and Fort Worth, but sometimes down in Waco where I lived 100 miles south of there. We organized parties and we dated all the beautiful girls we could find, and we went water skiing and ice skating and movies and symphonies and wild weekends. But mostly it was talking and talking and talking and talking and talking. Ladon was a young IBM salesman at that time, in the same office, by the way, I think next door to Ross Perot, another young IBM salesman. And I was an engineering student, having just come back from a long 5-month trip around Europe and the Middle East, which opened my eyes to a lot of things beyond Waco, Texas. And Ladon and I had grown up in similar religious backgrounds in Texas, but mine especially had been full of hellfire and brimstone, and somehow out of touch with what I was beginning to discover on out beyond Waco. And Ladon and I became soulmates, brothers, in this search for something beyond what we had known already. There was a young President, John F. Kennedy, who had just been elected a few months earlier, and there was this terrifying arms race that just hovered over all of us, of course. And Ladon and I were looking desperately for a way to cope with all of this, in fact to make our own marks somehow. Now, I had decided to join Kennedy's new Peace Corps, but Ladon was still thinking at that point in his career with IBM that IBM might give him some opportunities to make this difference we were searching for. And he hadn't, very long before that, you remember, as you mentioned a few minutes ago, he had been in the Air Force himself. But we were concerned about things like nuclear war, for sure, but we just weren't sure what we should do about it. So a lot of times after Ladon and I finished the parties and all of that and took our dates home, man, we'd go out and we would talk literally all night long. A number of times we talked until the sun rose about these kinds of issues. And then I went to Malaysia as a Peace Corps volunteer just as Kennedy was assassinated, but Ladon and I continued our dialogue. It was through, countless letters back and forth across the Pacific. And meanwhile, Ladon, as you mentioned a few minutes ago, was rocketing up through the ranks of IBM, transferring from Dallas to San Francisco and then to headquarters in New York City. And when I wasn't overseas with the Peace Corps, I'd get to visit him from time to time, and boy, did we ever enjoy the best restaurants there were. Top of the mark, the fine restaurants around Sausalito and so on in the San Francisco area. And in New York, we hit Broadway, of course, and did all sorts of things. And in the meantime, I married Carolyn, and she began to be part of this too. We lived a pretty high life there for a short time as Ladon's good friends. One of the wildest weekends, I'll never forget it, was in New York when Ladon took Carolyn and me to see The Man of La Mancha on Broadway, and I've thought ever since of Ladon as my Don Quixote, and I'm kind of tagging along as Sancho. In the late 1960s, well, Carolyn and I were in South Korea, was where I was there on the Peace Corps staff overseeing some of the Peace Corps volunteers along the DMZ. Something profound happened. A package arrived from Ladon Sheats he sent me several of these big reel-to-reel tape recordings that he had made of this guy that he had discovered, Clarence Jordan. And Ladon sent a letter along with those tapes. I remember it said, "Don, whatever you're doing, no matter how important it is, stop what you're doing and listen to these tapes. This man has something to say." And to be honest, at first I could just barely understand what Clarence was saying because of this South Georgia accent that it was all brand new to me. But wow, in a short time, I was eager to know more. And in a very real sense, it was as though Clarence had been listening in on a lot of those all-night discussions that Ladon and I had had for years. And I was just blown away by his profound knowledge of the gospel and the way he put into practice down at this strange place called Koinonia in South Georgia. So, as you mentioned, late in '69, Ladon made the move from IBM to the much more meager, simple quarters that he lived in there, and the treehouse and downstairs in what they call the treehouse at Koinonia. And just as Carolyn and I returned from our 2 years in Korea, Ladon really turned up the heat and really began to persuade us to come over and see this place, Koinonia. And a few months later, we moved there too, although we were too late to meet Clarence himself. Those next 8 years at Koinonia were full of, for me, very profoundly important experiences for both Carolyn and me. And Ladon was at the heart of much of the most profound of those experiences. And I won't try to tell all that history of those 8 years, but the really more like 4 or 5 that Ladon and I were both there at the same time. But I'll just say that against the backdrop of the Vietnam War, you can be sure that it was war and peace issues that dominated things. And the central theme of my relationship with Ladon had been already, but now it really became how to go about being a peacemaker in this world of violence. And all of us who knew Ladon know that he didn't just automatically agree nice and sweetly on everything. We had a lot of pretty strong arguments. But it seems strange now that I argued with Ladon and disagreed with him, it seems, as much as I agreed with him during those years, as we both were searching for how to be peacemakers in this world. He was much more confrontational in his approach than I was at that stage, for sure. Later, I ended up taking a few turns in jail myself and some time in prison for tax resistance and so on. But in the end, after several years of really meaningful struggle and work together, still loving each other very much but disagreeing very often, I think I was part of the reason, that a big part, that Ladon chose then to move on from Koinonia, because I was finding his approach too aggressive or too confrontational. And the board of directors decided that they agreed with me, and then in a sense it was painful for both of us. They took Ladon out of the position of being the coordinator of Koinonia. This was 1974, and in a way that was not a victory by any means for me, but painful. But they asked me to take over as coordinator. And a few months later, late 74, early 75, I'm not sure, Ladon chose to move on away from Koinonia. But I want to give one final vignette that is very important for me, because Ladon and I never ceased to be brothers. We, even after that disagreement about how to put our peacemaking into action, we stayed in touch year after year after year. We saw each other from time to time. And in September of 1998, just 4 years before Ladon passed on, it was our great joy here at Jubilee to commission Ladon. He came here to Jubilee, and upstairs in this building, the office where I'm sitting now, we laid hands on Ladon and prayed for him, and he led a delegation on Jubilee's behalf to Baghdad, taking truckloads of medicine to those children who were dying by the thousands there because of the awful United Nations sanctions, mainly in place because the U.S. was pushing them through over objections from other countries. Ladon delivered that medicine, and then he came back and reported to us, and man, I tell you, it was full of tears of reconciliation as well as tears of sadness on behalf of children who suffer around the world. But what a joy it was to work with Ladon on such a project just one time more. And I just want to close my comments by saying thank you, thank you, thank you, Chad and Elaine and Dennis and Tensie, for the way you in particular provided such a warm, loving hospice care and environment for Ladon during his final weeks. And I'm so glad I was able to come out just a few days before he died and to participate in a communion service. And I get a bit emotional at this point, but as I stepped out of Ladon's room that last time, Ladon called, "I love you, Don." And to be very honest with you, I wouldn't trade that experience and that memory for the Hope Diamond or all the gold in the world. Ladon is still a very, very living part of my life today. Thank you, brother. I look forward to seeing you again face to face. Thank you.
Don, thank you, brother. And you've given us beautiful and poignant testimony. Before we move on, I do want to give you a couple of minutes to tell the audience about your book that recently came out that tells the story of your life, and about what you're currently doing in North Korea. Now I can't hear.
Well, thank you, Chad. The book you were referring to, my second book, is one called Faith Beyond Borders, Doing Justice in a Dangerous World. And man, I can absolutely assure you that book would not even have started, let alone gone through all of the adventures that I try to recount in the 150 pages of it, if it hadn't been for Ladon Sheats. This is a book that in reality I could say Ladon was sort of my invisible co-author. It's full of stories about going mainly to war zones all over the world. I've been in more than 70 countries now, and have taken many delegations to war zones in the Middle East and Central America and East Asia and so on. And I think Ladon would approve of I'm happy to say, of 99% of what we've been able to do, and we've seen God's love, the power of God's love. I'm a man full of hope now because of all of this, not full of despair or depressed about the world situation. It's very, very serious, no question. But I've seen so many beautiful, hopeful experiences. And currently, I'm struggling very hard to help launch a project through the Fuller Center for Housing in North Korea. For 6 years now, I have been working with Dr. Han Park and then with the people of he is the head of the Center for the Study of Global Issues at the University of Georgia, and he is one of the nation's leading experts on North Korea, and one of the very few who actually has the trust on both sides enough that he can go back and forth. He landed in Pyongyang just about 6 hours ago, and he's doing his best. I've been over twice now to North Korea to try to help get this project started that will initially consist of 25 duplexes out north of Pyongyang for the farmers out north of Pyongyang. And if you get Fuller Center for get the Faith Beyond Borders book, it has a chapter that tells about this. I hope to be back there 1 month from now to build the first of those duplexes.
Thank you very much, Don. Thank you very much. We're going to turn your microphone off now, and thank you so much. I hope you'll stay with us for the rest of the seminar. Here you see a picture of Ladon and Dallas, who were rolling with Don in Koinonia back in the day, and that was just beautiful testimony. Don, thank you, brother, for taking time to do that. I also want to commend to the participants on the webinar the 2 reflections written by Steve Clemens of Minneapolis that were attached in your email and that are up in the files. As a result of hearing Ladon, back in, I think, 1974, Steve, if I'm correct, Steve went to live in at Koinonia and ended up spending 16 years there. And Steve Clemens is a committed peace activist, very much in the tradition of Ladon, with whom he was close friends. And he is on the webinar today, although he's chosen not to share live. Although, Steve, if you change your mind, just text Tim and we'll find a way to bring you up. But Steve has been a wonderful supporter of Ladon over the years and of our work and of the webinar work that we're doing. So thanks, Steve, for offering us the recent blogs that you wrote on both Ladon and on Clarence, which are downloadable. As Steve mentioned in the chat function, and Steve's giving some good information here in the chat about donating to the North Korea project. But as Steve mentioned earlier, by 1974-75, Ladon was increasingly pulled to witness against the war in Vietnam and against militarism in general. Recognizing the growing differences with others at Koinonia about the appropriateness of public witness, Ladon left Koinonia to join the recently formed Jonah House community in inner-city Baltimore, Maryland. There he joined Elizabeth McAlister, a former Roman Catholic nun, and her husband, activist priest Philip Berrigan. They had gained notoriety in the late 60s because of their nonviolent resistance to the Vietnam War. Known for civil disobedience actions in the spirit of public liturgy, Jonah House has for more than 40 years now been on the forefront of prophetic witness against militarism and the nuclear arms race. They have mentored hundreds of young activists, including myself, worked among the urban poor, and today are experimenting with urban homesteading, having transformed an abandoned inner-city cemetery into productive fruit orchards and vegetable gardens. The consistent gospel message coming from Jonah House has been that if Christians do not experiment with nonviolence as a way of life, then the world will be sentenced to unending wars of empire. Ladon was part of that community for several years. Liz McAlister was invited to be part of this webinar. Unfortunately, she was unable to join us because of family commitments with a brand new baby grandson. But she wanted to make a point of sending her love along to everyone. It was a couple of years later, during the nation's bicentennial year, the Carter presidential victory, the disco craze, some of you remember those times. It was during that year that I met Ladon, 1976. And shortly after meeting him, went to join him at Jonah House. And as I said earlier, my life was never the same, as I too was called into a discipleship of peacemaking and resistance to violence. Ladon left Jonah House in 1979 in order to pursue full-time peace witness. He was seriously considering going to the Pacific Northwest to join his friends Jim and Shelley Douglas in Pacific Life Community's anti-Trident campaign at Ground Zero Center for Nonviolent Action, located by the Trident base on the Puget Sound. Ladon, like so many of us, had been strongly influenced by Jim's theology of Gandhian engagement, particularly by his still classic book, The Nonviolent Cross. And Mike Miles, who's tuning in from Wisconsin, welcome Mike, has just chatted that folks should, you see here the cover of the re-released Nonviolent Cross by Jim Douglas, and Mike Miles is reminding us that probably Ladon's favorite book was a book by Rubem Alves, a Brazilian liberation theologian and poet, which was recently republished by Whipfenstock, called Tomorrow's Child. And Tim, maybe if you could type into the chat box, Tomorrow's Child by Rubem Alves. Thank you, Mike, for that reminder. We had actually considered trying to get Rubem onto this webinar as well, but weren't able to be quite that ambitious, mostly because we don't know how to get in touch with Rubem. But these were some of the important influences in Ladon's life. But in the end, Ladon decided to become itinerant, and he began to initiate a series of prayer pilgrimages at nuclear weapons plants such as Rocky Flats in Colorado and Pantex in Texas. Someone who worked closely with him during this period is Hetty Zawatsky. A Mennonite from Ontario, Canada. Hetty, today in her early 80s, is one of the revered elders in our faith-based peace movement and a dear friend. And Hetty, now will ask you to unmute your microphone as you did before. So go up to the icon and unmute it, and we'll be able to hear you. And we're going to hear some stories from Hetty about the 1970s and 80s.
Speak up, Hetty. I'm trying to hopefully...
Speak up, Hetty.
Unmute.
Yeah.
Now you can hear me? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Go ahead and start talking.
Okay. You can hear me now, right? Okay. I'm assuming you can hear me. I am honored to be invited to participate here. I met Ladon in October of '73 at Koinonia, had heard of him and what he was saying and doing about discipleship. And my struggle at that time was how to be faithful to some of the convictions that were growing in me, because I had been in the Middle East with the Palestinians, refugees, and I wanted to not pay war taxes. I was working in the church in Henderson, Nebraska at the time. And in my struggle to find some answers for that, I heard about this person and ended up in that year to going to Koinonia, where I met Ladon. And the bookends of what I am saying today are connected with meals. My first meal with Ladon was, and few friends, was in his home at Koinonia. My last supper with Ladon was, that was in '73. My last supper with Ladon was in at Elaine Ence's parents' home in Saskatoon in October of '99, after your wedding, Elaine and Ched. And that was 26 years later, although we had connections after that. But so those meals were fellowship meals. And they provided, as I said, the bookends for a whole plethora of the experiences. I have dedicated today, in thinking about Ladon, I've listened to a tape. I have some tapes from him. I have read some letters. I have done some pondering. And so my remarks are very much a distilled essence of our relationship and our friendship. He impacted my life in ways that I can't even say. Basically, I've divided those, if I may, into 3 areas. In the first years when we were friends, I gathered from him information about the state of the world and militarism and the principalities and powers and the poor, along with inspiration. And that inspiration connected with my spirit because it came, as I perceived, from a deep Christocentric, faithful discipleship aspiration. The second phase of our friendship was when we and many others participated in many different witnesses, all the way from Washington, D.C. to Colorado to Texas. We can't detail those at this point. And I was living in various places at the time that enabled that to happen. The third phase of our relationship was when I was called by several peace communities to be part of the White Train Witness in Amarillo, Texas. Ladon would come by to what I called my pustinia. Pustinia is a Russian name for house of prayer or something like that. And during those years, he was very encouraging and undergirding. And let me just say that I had been in Texas because we'd had some witnesses there with Mary and Peter and several other people. I also was able to connect with his family, his mother, his father, his brothers, because I was in Texas, not far from where they lived, in Lubbock. Then the fourth phase of our relationship was when after I moved back to Canada in '88, because I had aging parents. He was so affirmative about that calling. And also at that, during those years, I was very involved with Christian peacemaker teams. And I would often speak to the trainees in our training sessions, mostly in Chicago, about this man. I had slides, and I would talk about this disciple of Christ, this inspiring peacemaker. And I want to say that Ladon is so much a part of my spiritual inspiration that even a few weeks ago, when Brad Langendonen was here, who has been a CPTer in Iraq and is now a student in Winnipeg, I was able to share a bit of a tape where we heard the voice of Ladon. I want to see if I can have you also hear that. I pray that you may.
Would like to do that.
It's not coming through very well. I'm sorry about that. That was an effort, but now I would like to briefly quote from one of the many, many letters that he wrote to myself, and I know many other people. This is written from one of his times when he was in prison. And it has a picture, a drawing of the dove. I know you can't see it because it's just a pencil sketch. But this is what he says. Great ideas, it has been said, come into the world as gently as doves. Perhaps then, if we listen attentively, we shall hear, amid the uproar of empire and nations, a faint flutter of wings, the gentle stirring of life and hope. And that's by Camus. And this reminds me, this dove, of when we went out right after Chudney Lane's wedding, and many of us were gathered north of Saskatoon at Elaine's sister's place. And it was a time during the night when the northern sky was illuminated with northern lights in Saskatchewan. And I went out, and Ladon said to me, he had been out earlier, he said he saw the shape of a dove in those northern lights. Now, how attentive is that? I'm going to end with another quote from Ladon from Bread and Wine. We are saved today by freeing our spirit from resignation to the existing disorder. Spiritual life has always meant a capacity for sacrifice. In a society like ours, a spiritual life can only be a revolutionary life. Praise be to God.
Eddie,
yes.
Thank you very much. I just want to ask you to
thank you very much.
add two things.
Just want to ask you to
One
add
is,
two
I want
things.
you to talk a little bit about how we all met at
I
Rocky
want you to
Flats,
talk a little bit about how
and the
we all
action
met
there
at
in
Rocky Flats.
1979.
Yes.
And then I'd
the
like you
action there in
to close by saying a
1979.
quick word about
And then I'd like
Christian
you
Peacemaker
to
team.
close by saying a quick word about
Well,
Christian Peacemaker
we
team.
met at Rocky Flats for about 3 days of reflection, prayer, communion, and lots of fun. Ladon was a great humorist, too. And you were there, and we were meeting in the home of a beloved friend, I can't think of her name right now, and you were playing the guitar as we were singing, I remember that. And then we went out to Rocky Flats. And there was a witness there. I'm more clear on the witness at Rocky Flats that some of us did on Christmas Day in 1980, so I can't give you much more information on this. Is there something particular that you want me to reference?
No, that's fine. I just recall that as the place we met.
No, that's,
right.
that's fine. I just
conclude
recall that
by
as the place we met.
Talking about
Just conclude by
very quickly
talking
your service with
about
CPT.
your very quickly your service with CPT.
Christian Peacemaker teams came out of a call to the Mennonites at Mennonite World Conference in 1974 by Ron Sider, where he challenged the Mennonites from all over the world to consider whether in our peacemaking we could be as brave as soldiers and give our lives for the sake of the gospel. That started a whole plethora of study, and after 2 years there was a gathering in Chicago where we met, and that is where in 1986 in December the call for peacemakers to be active and to go beyond the quiet in the land and to take some risks for peacemaking, to be nonviolent peacemakers, active peacemakers. That call was issued at what we call Techni in Chicago. And then since then, Gene Stoltzfus, who has joined Ladon in a cloud of witnesses, and the steering committee, of which some of us were participants for quite a long time, like 24 years, worked at training young people, at sending them out to hot places in the world to try to nonviolently intervene in between warring parties. In other words, putting our lives on the line for the sake of peacemaking, for the sake of being lights in the world of great darkness.
Thank you very much, Hetty.
Thank you very much, Hetty.
You're welcome.
We appreciate you joining us and
We
tackling
appreciate
the
you joining us and tackling the
and you are a
technology.
beautiful sister and mother in the faith.
And you are
You're
a
very
beautiful
kind.
sister
I love
and mother
being
in the
with you.
faith.
I love being in solidarity.
Stay on.
Okay.
So stay on.
we're gonna, okay. The prison time that resulted from Ladon's acts of nonviolent civil disobedience was hard because of his consistent refusal to cooperate with the oppressive incarceration system. And yet his long periods of solitary confinement in some ways deepened his contemplative spirit. When out of prison and between actions, Ladon spent continuing long periods of solitude in a much more renewing space, St. Benedict's Trappist Monastery near Snowmass, Colorado. Over many years, Ladon became accepted there as a lay brother, and he lived and worked contentedly with the community in its farm work and praying its hours of prayer. Unfortunately, Father Charlie from the monastery was unavailable to participate in this webinar, but it's not an overstatement to say that St. Benedict's became Ladon's spiritual home, and he invited many of us to share it with him for short stretches. Particularly beloved to him were two old hermitages. One lay up the mountain, nestled in an aspen grove at the base of his beloved Mount Sopris. The old cabin, which no longer exists now, had no electricity or running water, and one had to hike several miles into it, so few of the monks used it, which was fine with Ladon, who spent long stretches there communing with the spectacular natural community residing in the western slopes of the Rockies. You minimize my thing and maximize that. Ladon was fond especially of the elk, and on his hikes he would forever try to shout out to warn them to flee during hunting season. The other favorite hermitage of Ladon's on the monastery property was a ramshackle cabin beside a creek, which Ladon dubbed Gobo. He would spend his last days in a hospice room built by faithful friends in Santa Maria, California, which they dubbed Gobo West. Another place of refuge, reflection, and service for Ladon was the Rosebud Reservation of South Dakota. But the truth is, he was itinerant, living out of a backpack and famously traveling by Greyhound. He fashioned elaborate itineraries in order to visit friends around the country, weaving a web of intimacy that remains strong to this day. As Sandy Lejeune says in his brief reflection that is attached up in the files, Ladon was always keen to have his vast and diverse circle of friends meet each other. And indeed, when that has happened, the network of kindred spirits around the country would grow. So, for example, on this webinar right now is Sandy Lejeune in Santa Barbara and Mike Miles in Wisconsin. And the two of them met through Ladon and became very close friends. One of the places Ladon kept coming back to was the Los Angeles Catholic Worker in East Los Angeles. There, too, he was accepted as an extended community member, and he worked faithfully in their efforts to feed the homeless and to do hospice with the indigent. Tim, do we have Jeff? We don't. Do we have anybody from the... We've got Tensie. All right. We tried to get Jeff and some folks from the LA House on, but I think it was a mixture of technological struggles and impatience with technological struggles. So we don't have them, and we're sorry for that. But what we are going to bring up Tensie Hernandez, who was part of the LA Worker during the times that Ladon was visiting, and also with her is Brian Buckley, who was part of the community during the 1990s. And so I do want to plug Jeff's book, Jeff Dietrich's book, which was recently published and chronicles life at the LA Worker. It's called Broken and Shared: Food, Dignity, and the Poor on Los Angeles' Skid Row. It's available through Loyola Marymount Press. But we're, I think, going to bring on Tensie, and she's going to speak briefly to Ladon's experience at the LA Worker. So welcome back, Tensie.
Hey everybody. It's very, very good to be here. And actually, I did get to meet Ladon while I was living at the LA Worker, and it was close to my last year of being there in 1990 that Ladon first called while he was in prison at the Metropolitan Detention Center. And he was looking to have anybody in the community come and visit him there, where he was actually, well, he was waiting to be sentenced, and finally was sentenced to a year and spent that year at MDC. And the rest of the community, because of issues that they were having with either warrants or different problems that they had with, well, basically with, well, I guess with just the whole incarceration institution, it turned out that I was the only one that could visit Ladon, and so I did. And at the time, he was in solitary at MDC, and he would come downstairs, and we would have these amazing, amazing conversations about so many things. And I was quite young, not even 21, and he really introduced me to an aspect of discipleship that I, quite frankly, hadn't experienced as of yet, you know, and so much of it had to do with the integration of prayer and action and faithfulness that was quite heartening. And really, with his life, he was able to demonstrate what that meant. And so it was through our conversations in prison that a big part of my own journey really came to life. I've got Brian here with me, part of the circle of friends that got to care for Ladon. So, you want to say anything about your experience with, yeah, Ladon in LA?
So I was quite new to the LA Worker in '99, I think, and had heard about, I was very curious. My brother was in the seminary in LA, which is why I went, and I heard about the LA Worker. He thought it might be something that would work for me. So I went and was in the summer program and was hearing the stories about the Varigans, the Ladon, the kitchen, and Dorothy Day, and was very intrigued. And I thought, this is something that I want to explore a bit more and pursue more. And sure enough, Ladon came down from the mountain and visited us, and was staying there. And he did the cultural critique and heard his story. And at the LA Worker, every Wednesday at the time, there was a trip out to the Little Sisters of something or another, the Poor, that probably took 2.5 hours, 3 hours. We'd go all the way out to San Pedro, pick up a bunch of food, sugar, and bring it back and unload it and do a Friday morning coffee breakfast thing. And so there was a pattern. It was Ladon and I doing that every Wednesday, and I was the curious one who was just driving and asking Ladon. I'd have these questions prepped to ask Ladon about, like 3 questions, and I'd be like, "So Ladon," and he would just talk, and he would share, and he would just, you know, really generously share his life with me, and I just ate it all up, and I really loved the devotion, the intention, the poetry and the humor and the resistance that he had in many things. And there wasn't really a pattern to Ladon. And actually, that's not true. I mean, I didn't know the pattern of his answers, but he was an extremely routine man. Like, he was going to be there when he said he was going to be there, and he was very faithful to his time. And he had great relationships with the guys in the soup kitchen line. People who would see him. James Brown loved Ladon. James Brown and Ladon got along famously, you know, and Ladon would wear his bandana and pour water to people in the line, and just very proper and hospitable and not bothered by outbursts or whatever. And yeah, considered Catherine more as the binding agent that held the Catholic worker together, you know. Jeff was the mouthpiece, and Catherine Morris was the foundation, he said. And so, yeah, he sort of tapped into what was going on, you know, and but he also excused himself for certain things. I don't think he really came to Bible study. I don't know. But he had his own routine at the Catholic worker because he was, you know, tenured or whatever. He had special privileges. But he definitely did all the servings, and always up to Vandenberg and to see Dennis and Tensie whenever that happened, and Wednesday night liturgies. I remember when Thomas was born, I was just telling Tensie the other day, and she hadn't heard this, that he went out and picked a bunch of daisies and passed them out to everyone in the congregation, or the circle, that we think of the new life that has been brought into this world, and how we as a community need to, you know, protect this goodness, you know. And he saw himself as, you know, or considered grandfather, and I think he considered Tensie as his, you know, daughter, and they had a very, very special relationship. And to be included in those last few months of his life was a great honor. And all the people that came, who I met, hi everybody, if I met you before, it was such a great honor to be a part of that. And you know, the carpenters that came, and the old resistors, and the massage therapists, and yeah, it was fantastic. And I was with him the night he died, and it was quite beautiful to sit in the quiet when he took his last breaths. And all
right, well, Brian,
yeah.
stick around because you're jumping a little bit ahead. We're almost there. We're going to keep you guys up on the screen, and just want to tell one more story related to the LA Catholic worker. This is a hilarious story dating to 1995. Preparing for this webinar, I ran across this old snapshot, and Charlita scanned it in. We were, along with the LA Catholic worker, we were all at the Nevada test site near Las Vegas for the 50th anniversary of Hiroshima. And at dawn, we went to pray at the test site while Jeff was busy cutting barbed wire fence. To our surprise, we were arrested, but we were released without charge. They only took Jeff because he was the one cutting fence. We were only trespassing, so we decided to beat the heat in Vegas and go have lunch at a local Mexican restaurant with old friends from my Berkeley community days, and some of them are pictured here. Clancy Dunnigan and George Rodkey. I think Clancy might be on the webinar. I don't know if he is or not. But so we're at this Mexican restaurant, and the waiter is fixing balloon hats for kids because it's hot and everybody's cranky. So Ladon says, let's get some balloon hats. So we call the guy over, and he makes a bunch of balloon hats for us around the table. And then Ladon says, can you connect the hats? And so, yeah, he says, yeah. So as you can see, there are all these connections between the balloon hats. So that was pretty fun. And then Ladon says, I think we need to spread the gospel of balloons. So we get out of the restaurant, we walk out of the restaurant, all still connected with balloon hats, 5 of us, and we walk next door into one of the big casinos. And here we are, walking into the casino, 5 of us connected by balloon hats, and the place was packed because, you know, it was air conditioning. The crowd just parted like the Red Sea. They didn't know what to make of us, and we're walking in and we're greeting people and smiling, and we go over to the high stakes poker pit, and we're just standing there with our balloon hats on, and nobody could play poker because they couldn't concentrate. And finally, we see security coming, right? And so we didn't know if we were going to try to get arrested twice in the day. So we started our way back out of the casino, and Ladon starts chanting, "Children," he says, "we just want you to remember, balloons are funner than money." And then we all started chanting, "Balloons are funner than money. Balloons are funner than money," and people in the crowd started chanting with us, "Balloons are funner than money," as we made our way out of the casino. So that was an amazing moment in our fun times with the Ladon. It wasn't always serious. So I want to now welcome into the podium Elaine, and she's going to start making the transition to talk about the final chapter in Ladon's life.
Now, keep me small. I'm good. Hello, friends. It is very good to be with you. Thank you to all of you that have shared stories already. We're just getting situated here. So I first met Ladon, and I met Dennis and Tensie at the same time at the Guadalupe Catholic Worker in 1997. And so this picture is from a walk that we took that weekend on Oso Flaco Beach. It's Tensie and Ladon kneeling there, Sandy Lejeune, and me and Ched. Wow, don't we look a whole lot younger back then. Little did we know how prescient this meeting was. On Good Friday, 2002, while in Lubbock, Texas, caretaking his 93-year-old father, Ladon discovered that he had suddenly become strangely jaundiced. And a week later, after exploratory surgery, he was diagnosed with terminal pancreatic cancer. Ched and I were in Greensboro, North Carolina at the time, helping to run the first Word and World School, and the news hit our hearts like a sledgehammer. Ched immediately left to join Tensie and Dennis and several of Ladon's family and friends at his bedside in the Lubbock Hospital. It was a very intense and difficult week. We were all in shock. The last time that any of us had seen Ladon, he had been in wonderful health, and now he looked absolutely awful. We actually didn't know if he was going to make it out of the hospital alive, and our late-night conversation centered on where we could bury him and how we would transport his body, and it would have to be illegally across state lines. Buoyed by prayer and our round-the-clock presence, Ladon really rebounded, and he decided to not try any further medical intervention, and so those at Lubbock Hospital talked about discerning how and where we would take him from hospice. We were all ill-prepared, but none of us were half-hearted. This man was so important to us that we knew that we would do whatever it took to give him a good space to finish his journey. Some years before, Tensie had told Ladon that she wished to care for him when he was infirm, and now that moment had arrived in a way that none of us could have imagined. At his hospital bedside, Tensie reiterated her offer, and without a clue of how this would actually happen, Dennis added, "And we can build a room in our garage. Our home is yours." Without hesitation, Ladon accepted. Now was the difficult task of figuring out how to get him from Texas to California. Ladon at this point was far too weak to endure a drive across 4 states. And so, as we were mulling over this conundrum, Ladon's brother Morris offered to make a couple of phone calls to see about a plane. We shrugged this off, unaware of the fact that Morris, at that time the pastor of a wealthy Dallas megachurch, actually had parishioners who had private jets. So a few hours later, Morris reported that a Learjet had been arranged to fly Ladon and Tensie as his attendant from the local private airport in Lubbock to San Luis Obispo, California. We looked at each other with incredulity, gratitude, and no small measure of bemusement. This was beyond ironic. The man who 35 years earlier had walked away from the world of high-rolling executive jet-setting in order to commit his life to the poor and peacemaking would now take one last flight. The next morning, Ladon was wheeled out of the hospital onto the tarmac and into the plane, and folks gathered around singing, "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot." Tensie and Ladon arrived hours later in Santa Maria, and that's the central home of Tensie and Dennis and their 2 children, pictured here, Rosella and Thomas. There, Ladon and all of us who helped care for him began a 4-month journey of hospice that was in equal parts taxing and transforming. During this time, I guess he was probably around 12 months old, Thomas Ladon took his first steps and said his first words, and Homer Ladon took his last. Dennis and Tensie opened their lives in the deepest possible sense, and a crazy quilt of community arose to the task. Ladon used to say, "In the spiritual realm, something is set in motion by every true act of faith." And for us, the hospice journey was an act of true faith, and what it set in motion, we are still trying to fathom. Ladon had no assets, no pension plan, no health insurance, having bet his life on Jesus' promise that whosoever would release themselves from family, possession, and home would receive them back 100-fold. His investments were exclusively in relationships, in witness, and in service. And it was precisely the amazing web of friendship and care that he wove throughout his life that became his social security. Never have we witnessed such a spontaneous and sustained outpouring of mutual aid, such unquestioned devotion to a friend, such determination to return kindnesses received than during our 4-month hospice effort in Central California. The Guadalupe and Los Angeles Catholic worker communities and our Bartimaeus Cooperative Ministries cobbled together the basic personnel, logistical, financial, and moral resources, and then relied very heavily on the solidarity of people around the country. Countless individuals and families from Ladon's extraordinary network of friends offered whatever was needed, from prayers and visits to body work and cooking, and just enough financial support to cover the costs of this hospice adhocracy. It was as if Ladon, in his last chapter, was orchestrating a convergence of his widely scattered circles. Here was a parable of death and resurrection. As Ladon's body atrophied, the body of those in communion with him over the years expanded. No one better to share about this amazing experience than Tensie and Dennis, who opened their home, their family, and themselves to this journey. So I want to turn over now to Dennis and Tensie to share some stories about hospice. So don't forget, friends, Dennis and Tensie, turn your microphone on. I'm going to turn mine off.
We're here. So it's hard to know where to begin. The hospice experience with Ladon was probably the most intense and moving experience that we've been through. We love Ladon something awful, and it was hard to watch him as he finished out his life, but the outpouring and the number of people that came to visit was at times overwhelming. I remember when Ladon arrived in Santa Maria, he came on a Learjet that his brother Morris had arranged for. He landed at the Santa Maria airport. It looked like an angel coming in as we were on the tarmac waiting for him, with an old van with the seats taken out and a mattress put in. And we carried Ladon down the steps of that jet and into the back of the van and took him to our home, where we had a wheelchair waiting. And when we took him out of the back of the van and into the wheelchair, he said, "No, don't take me in the house. I want to go for a walk." And around the block we went. So Ladon could just, breathe the air and relish being out of the hospital. And Ladon had kind of a resurgence. He left the hospital not being able to walk, but the first month or so of his hospice experience, he regained some energy. He would come and sit at table with us, and he would have prayer with us. We had some excursions to the beach. You've seen some pictures. And it was almost as if he was coming back. He seemed almost to be recovering. But little by little, his energy and his life force began to wane.
And I would just add that that it was actually in the plane on the way back, that when he was put on the plane, he was essentially brought in laying flat, and the chair was sort of extended out so that he could be as horizontal as possible. And on the plane there was this map that was being generated via computer, and it was showing all the places that we were passing. And so we were on the plane, and we were looking, he was looking at the map, and then like he thought that he might recognize some of these places if he could just see over the window. So he sort of started sitting up in the chair, and he would peek out the window, and he'd lay back down, and he'd talk about that particular place and how he had been there on his way to or back from some action, and the people that were there with him. And then he'd sort of lay back, and he'd look back again at the map, and now we were over Arizona, and then he'd sit up again, and he'd talk a little bit about the last time he was there and who he was with. And actually, by the time we were coming through to Santa Maria, he was actually sitting up. And I have to say that as we were flying, I think it dawned on us that healing was happening as he was dying. And so when he arrived, he was rather weak, but day by day his strength came more and more to him. And it was the hospice nurse who started questioning this, and knew his prognosis, knew what pancreatic cancer meant, but also knew that there was something different happening here. And it was Ladon who started talking about healing as one is dying, and it then started to dawn on us that Ladon had taught us how to live, and now he was teaching us how to die, and he was doing that with intention, with dignity, and with, above all, this strong belief that it was God and Jesus who was directing the course of his life. And so while we were sitting together during one liturgy that we had nearly daily, and it was really because of Chedney Lane and their commitment to song and prayer and doing that together, that we had most amazing liturgies. And it was during one liturgy that Ladon, having heard the story of Jesus saying that if you give your life, that everything will be given to you, that he said that he had bet his life on this, and that he had come to find the truth of it. And he looked around at the room and he said, I have been given family and homes and all I need. And so I think for all of us who were there with him, we were able to really get to experience the culmination of his life, and the dedication and what that meant to him and to all of us.
I would like to just, as long as we're telling stories, when Ladon found out he was sick, Tensie immediately flew to Lubbock, Texas, and I was at home with Thomas and Rosella. When Tensie called and said Ladon has terminal pancreatic cancer, I packed up Thomas and Rosella and got on a plane and flew to Lubbock to be with them. But I left our car at the LA Catholic Worker. So when we made the offer for Ladon to come back to our home, and I had spontaneously said, we will build a room, I packed the kids back up and got on a plane, leaving Tensie with Ladon in Lubbock, and came back to the Catholic Worker where my car was, and the community at Los Angeles wanted just an update about Ladon, and so we gathered in the third floor room, and I explained to them all that had happened in Lubbock. And Jeff asked me, well, what can we do to help? And I said, well, I've made this commitment to build a room, and if there were someone here who could help me with that, I would really appreciate it. And immediately Brian Buckley and Faustino Cruz raised their hands and said, we'd like to do that. And they left, and within 5 minutes they were back with their backpacks packed in 5 minutes. And we left, and they were with us for 4 months. And Brian and Faustino were, as they would call, an extension of our wills. And that was just the beginning of people coming from all over the United States. We had, cabinet makers, we had carpenters, we had electricians, we had people that knew everything would just show up. Tim drove straight through from Idaho with his truck full of all his tools, and we just put this room together that in the end a building inspector, which is a whole other story, said, I built a hospice room for my mother. I wish it would have turned out this beautiful. It was a beautiful space, and it was a perfect space for Ladon. It gave him this privacy, gave him a place where people that came to visit him could sit and talk to him. There's Corolla and, is it Ann?
Yeah.
with Ladon in our hospice room. So the experience is hard to explain, but it really was a coming together of people that we had always heard about from Ladon, who then showed up at our house, and it was really something beautiful to see. Never was money less of an issue than during that time. We built a room, we arranged for Ladon's burial, everything, and it just all was there. It just showed up. It was really beautiful. What say you, Brian? This is a picture of Ladon with his brother Morris to his right and his niece Shannon to his left, and Tensie and Shannon's sister-in-law. That's on our front porch. This is while we were still building the room for Ladon, and Ladon was still ambulatory.
Just a couple more things you guys might want to talk about. We got just a couple more minutes. The rhythm of life, your impressions, and then Elaine's going to talk a little bit about the dying situation.
Oh. Yeah, I'm sorry, Chid. What would you like us to talk about?
Just if there's anything else you want to say about the daily rhythm of hospice, and then Elaine is going to get on and talk about the actual dying and burial.
Well, the picture you see here is in our living room, and this is how we would gather on a daily basis. Ladon is not with us here because, in this picture, because he was already in his hospice room. This is a picture of Ladon and Thomas Ladon, or was there, it'll come back, I'm sure. But the liturgies were particularly nourishing and particularly intimate and very, very moving. And at one point when Ladon was very close to the end of his life, we had a baby monitor out in his room, and we kept the other end of it, the listening end of it, in our living room. And we'd have long moments of silence during our prayer where all we would hear is Ladon's labored breathing. And there was something about the rhythm of that labored breathing in our silence, coupled with, we often, you'll see a bowl on the table that has dried white sage, and we would light that as incense. And we'd light the candle and turn out the lights, and the incense would rise, and along with Ladon's breathing, there was a real sense that our unspoken prayers for Ladon were rising. It was very beautiful.
I think anybody who knew Ladon knew also of his circle of people, of friends, and of whom he called kindred spirits. And so these kindred spirits gathered every night, those of us who were actually there and those of us who were far, but we were all together. And it was this gathering of spirits that held us all each day as we cooked and cleaned and cared for kids and built rooms, and lest we not, forget that Ladon had very particular needs, and and those were sometimes difficult to attend to, but it was all of us truly. I felt that were the hands and feet and face that Ladon needed in order to pass over, and that as he had given each of us a certain birth and had midwifed us into a a new understanding of God, of ourselves in relation to God, of our own journey. Now we could reciprocate that to Ladon by birthing him into this new transformation.
Dennis and Tensie, thanks so much for sharing with us tonight, and thank you again for the opening up of your home and sharing that time together. Friends, we know this has been long, and we are gonna keep going. For some of us to relive this and to hear these stories, it hasn't been long at all. We're also trying to record this for future times. So if you can bear with us, we're going to keep going and talk a little bit about the ending, how we did the burial and things like that. And then we will open it up if there are folks that want to ask questions at the end. What we certainly learned is that dying is a mysterious process, even for holy people. And we often discussed, all of us that were gathered there, the parallels between Ladon's process of letting go and his namesake, little Thomas Ladon's struggles to take his first upright steps. And toward the end, we imagined the cloud of witnesses cheering Ladon on toward his new way of being, just as we adults were encouraging little Thomas to take his first steps. And to be sure, Ladon did struggle with the many aspects of this difficult passage, understandably riding an emotional roller coaster, and we certainly rode it with him. But in the end, he came to a place of acceptance, and he said, whether or not I'm physically cured, I believe the real healing has already begun. So complicating this spiritual process of dying are the politics of death care industry. And Laurel Dykstra is going to speak about that in a little bit. I had the task of researching green burials in an effort to put Ladon in the ground according to his wishes for simplicity and our desires to attend to his body. And we agreed with him that nature's intention was for our bodies to be reunited with the earth and eventually to recycle into new life. However, in conversations with the local mortuary, they told us that embalming was necessary and that there had to be a coffin and it had to be placed into a concrete vault. But in this green burial research, I found out that actually the law requires none of this. And in the process, I discovered this lively grassroots movement committed to burial that is healthy for the earth. It's meaningful for us as caregivers, and it is also respectful of the deceased. We decided with Ladon that the local village cemetery was the most practical place to lay him to rest, given our limitations of land and resources. And then we met with the caretaker to explore the possibilities of a green burial. He was an indigenous Chumash man, and he had never had anyone ask for this before, and he was sure that the board would not like it. But he also knew that it was not illegal, and to him it sounded more in keeping with the old ways. And when I broached the subject of Ladon's strong wish that the cemetery American flag not be flying on the day Ladon was buried, the caretaker asked why, and he listened very carefully as I described Ladon's commitments. You know, the caretaker responded, I think I would have liked your friend Ladon. I gave regular updates to the community on my research, and we discussed dimensions for digging the grave and options, different options for the markers. And when I reported that dry ice was the best way to preserve a body so that people could come and mourn and spend time with a body, Ladon quipped to me, Elaine, you know how much I hate to be cold. As we wondered how we were going to get the body to the cemetery and how to wrangle it into a grave that was 4 feet deep, yet again the right skills appeared just as we needed them. A Mennonite friend from the Midwest made a beautiful pine coffin in the backyard, which we used to transport Ladon's body, but not to bury it, because another friend sewed an exquisite hammock that was strong enough for the 4 of us to lower Ladon's body into the grave. Ladon's final weeks took on the shape of a vigil as we stayed with him in turn around the clock. It became what could only be described as labor indeed. And Tensie, you often reflected frequently and eloquently on the similarities between birthing and dying. On August 5th, we gathered for Vespers in Ladon's room and celebrated Eucharist. And early on August 6th, the day we commemorate both the Transfiguration of Christ and the Disfiguration of Hiroshima, Ladon slipped quietly into a coma. 24 hours later, his arduous journey of crossing over was completed. For 56 hours, we lived with Ladon's body, and it was a powerful time for all of us. We interestingly kind of broke up along gender lines, and the women, we washed Ladon's body and lovingly clothed it, brushed his hair, and the men went to the cemetery and dug the grave, and dug the grave at Guadalupe Community Cemetery. The hospice room was converted into a chapel, and dozens of people came to pay last respects. We continued to pray around the body and noted how curious and unafraid little Rosella and Thomas were, and they also prayed and touched Ladon's body and vigiled with us. Of course, the whole time we wept and laughed and told stories late into the night. A memorial bonfire burned in the backyard the whole time. And this was Ladon's final gift to us, inviting us to discover how to embrace in death the radical simplicity and profundity that he embraced in life. On August 9th, Nagasaki Day, we laid Ladon's body in the ground with a sunrise ceremony attended by more than 100 people. For the first time in weeks, for the exact time of our service, the morning fog had cleared. There were some songs, only a few words, and then his body, clothed in his old plaid shirt, jeans, and beloved bandana, was lowered, the sling almost, but not quite, tearing. And when we were done, the fog moved back in, covering the newly planted olive tree at the head of the grave with the Pacific Ocean mist. The cemetery flag was not raised that morning until long after we were gone.
These words hung on the wall of Ladon's hospice room beneath strands of brightly colored peace cranes, and became the object of much reflection for all of us. In the aftermath of his passing, those of us who were intensely involved in this experiment have struggled to understand its full meaning. We were at peace about our efforts, knowing that we did the best we could. Still, we have a sense that there's much we have to learn about what we went through. Ladon was our teacher by showing, not telling. And now we have a continuing sense of a deeper duty to take care of those who have given themselves to the way of radical discipleship. We continue to ponder how to die with dignity in our death culture. We marvel at the mystery of how community is shaped. And we long to trust more profoundly in the divine economy of grace. In that vein, we want to finally invite one more guest. Laurel Dykstra is finishing her editing of a collection of essays entitled Bury the Dead, Dying, Death, and Burial in the Radical Discipleship Movement. It's due out from Whiffenstock, I think, Laurel, toward the end of the year, and we welcome you. Thank you for enduring this long webinar, and we'd like you to talk a little bit about this project of yours.
So not endurance at all. Can folks hear me? You can hear? Yay. Okay. All of my, there are my documents. So the project that I'm working on is a collection of mostly stories and essays, the nucleus of which are stories just like the Caretaking the Gift narrative that Ched and Elaine have shared with us so far. They're stories of midwifing the dying, specifically hospice with family members and community members. Those stories are bracketed by broader stories of the experience of death in community, and the way that in this radical discipleship movement, some of the work that we're doing around death and dying is so deeply connected to the kind of resistance work that we do to the culture of death around us. And so there are stories from hospice workers, from coffin builders. More broadly than that, there's stories of street engagements, vigils that happen at murder sites, stories from communities where there's a high level of accompanying vulnerable communities. There are stories of second lines and jazz funerals in New Orleans and the history of funeral resistance in the Black church. There are stories of Palestine, stories of Latin America, stories of individuals' refusal to accept the culture of death around them. There's biblical reflection, there's theological reflection, and some of the themes that we've talked about tonight that come together in the book are the themes of how our stories build on one another's stories, and how there's a chain of connections of who knew who and who met who when. Stories of resistance to the powers and principalities that happen very intimately in the hospice rooms of the dying, and that happen very publicly in prisons and in jails, that happen in street demonstrations, and that Care for the Dying is part of our greater movement of resistance. When I got the idea to begin to collect stories that I was hearing from being a longtime member of this community, I was struggling to write about having attended more than 100 street funerals in the urban context where I have lived for the last number of years. And I thought it would be cathartic and healing to work on this in community. And instead I've become the caretaker for all of these stories of grieving and dying and death. And when one of the stories is of Kyun Prather, who was a member of the LA Catholic worker community, who died in the 90s from AIDS. And the story of his passing and the story of his coming to community. And when those newspapers came to me in the mail, it was like holy relics. So to be the caretaker of these stories is a remarkable privilege, and to do this work in community is a remarkable thing. I am super mindful of the time that we've all given to one another, and I think maybe what I'll do to close what I have to say is to read a really short excerpt from my own reflection from my piece that will be in the book. And And while in some ways it's a departure from the personal storytelling around Ladon, I think that very much it touches on the issues and the culture of death that his life was in resistance to. So here goes, and I'll be quick. Started to do the math. Since 1992, when I first moved to the Catholic Worker, I've prayed at more than 100 street funerals, memorials, and vigils, sat on cold metal folding chairs in cheap funeral homes, community centers, and the common rooms of SRO hotels, in groups as large as 200 or as small as 3, to remember the lives and mark the passing of this society's least loved. Alcoholics, homeless veterans, sex offenders, crack dealers, junkies, transgender sex workers, thieves, cripples, schizophrenics, scabbed and smelling bad, who died by suicide, overdose, murder, disease, and none by old age. Where I live, people die so young you're eligible for the seniors programs at 45. And as we sit and listen or pray, I'm repulsed by the funeral urge, mine and others, to talk about these problem dead as babies, as once somebody's child, as if their adult lives needed to be erased and negated, as if they need to be reduced to something big-eyed, blunt, and helpless to remind others of their worth and value. Well, they were valuable as they fucking were. Hurt, damaged, dangerous, surviving and living. 100, 120, however many deaths it is, they add up. If they were coffins standing end to end, they'd run a city block. Of course, around here, most poor people are cremated. It's cheaper. So what about those little cardboard boxes with the body dust all sealed up in a tough plastic wrapper? 100 would still make quite a stack. Fill a cupboard, or maybe a closet. And so this writing is a little like coming out of the closet. For a long time I've been silent, a mute witness to the rising tide of bodies around me. For so many people in this neighborhood, and others where I've lived, their stories are the last thing they have, and journalists and researchers and photographers come seeking even that, posing people against the backdrop of syringe-littered alleys, telling stories to serve their own agendas. My friends who died, the last thing I want to do is take from you. But I'm angry all the time now, and I think it's time to speak. Up front, my friends, I would not, I will not use you as a sermon illustration, a poster child, or an object lesson. But my agenda in telling the stories is this: less dying, more love, and in the face of so many deaths, more outrage. I hope the letters that I've written to you are a gift, and not another thing taken. So that's all I got. Are you going to do questions?
Thank you, Laurel. What a gift.
Thanks for letting me take part.
I am wondering, Dennis and Tensie, do you have energy to see if there are a few questions chatted in from our intrepid people who are still online?
Absolutely.
So I want to let, if anybody's got a particular question or something they want to chat in, they can do so. We're going to let people take a minute to type in their questions, and we're going to try to handle this in a way that's not too confusing on the sound front. We'll ask whoever the question is directed to activate your microphone, and then when you're done, turn it off, because it's hard to do more than one microphone being on at a moment. We're getting a lot of gratitude coming across, and that's very appropriate for the kind of sharing that we've had tonight. I do want to encourage you all to look for Laurel's book when it comes out. Laurel, if you didn't mention when you think it might be out, if you want to type that in so people can know your best estimate, that'd be great. I think folks are probably pretty worn out after all 2 hours of this. Jim Ball from Canada, expressing gratitude. People have really hung in there, and we're very, very grateful. Again, thanks to all the presenters. We really have created a video record here, which will be online and accessible for anyone to access at any time. We will send out the link sometime in the next, probably early next week, and everybody can have it. And feel free to pass it on to your friends. Laurel is saying that her book should be out by the end of the year. Thank you so much, Laurel, for joining us in this webinar. I think what we'll do is just offer a benediction and let everybody go. So I guess the truthful thing to say is that Ladon Sheats was a complicated person, a sometimes inscrutable contradiction of intimacy and individualism, of mobility and rootedness, of initiative and quiet non-directiveness, of fierce conviction and humble receptivity. He was the best listener many of us have ever known, with an extraordinary capacity to elicit our individual struggles and dreams, to help us discern, to stay in touch despite distances. I think it's fair to say that no one who received Ladon's full attention and who heard his remarkable story was not moved deeply and changed. Ladon's absence is an irreparable tear in the fabric of our lives. He challenged us with the fullness of the gospel way and was a faithful companion through all the joyful, difficult twists of that way for decades. Our world is lonelier without him, but we're convinced that Ladon's death, like his life, will continue to present a singular challenge and inspiration to our discipleship. We began this webinar 2 hours ago talking about the disfiguration of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but also about the transfiguration of Jesus on Mount Tabor. So we end with a beautiful image of the place Ladon loved more than anywhere on earth, majestic Mount Sopris. As mentioned earlier, he would bring different ones of us up to this favorite refuge, this old cabin hermitage on a high mesa at the foot of Sopris. There, amidst golden aspen and snow-covered peaks and tumbling streams, he would recharge his spiritual wells that had been depleted from months of service to the poor, jail time stemming from resistance, and travel across the country to spend time with kindred spirits. Ladon truly embodied the spirit of Transfiguration. He too was a beloved child with whom God was well pleased. And we believe that we should still listen to his life and his witness, through which we see Jesus better. And I'm wondering, Tensie and or Dennis, if we could ask you to just say a benedictory prayer, if you'd turn your microphones on and just usher us out.
What's coming to me, Chad, that I think would be wonderful to include others with are maybe one of the songs that we sang so often during our time together at hospice, And one of the songs that you taught us that I'm thinking now that perhaps would be appropriate is the Courage song. Are you with me? So why don't you lead us, Ched?
Well, we're going to try. It's pretty hard to sing over the echoes, but I'm going to let Elaine take the lead because she's got the most beautiful voice among us.
What are we singing? Let's do it together. Okay, Tens. Here we go.
Go.
Courage, brother, you do not walk alone. We will walk with you and sing your spirit home. Thank you. Thank you, friends. Thank you for joining us today. Presente to Ladon Sheats.
See you next time, friends. Thanks for tuning in. Look in next week's email for a link to this webinar. You can view it again at your leisure. You can stop and start it. Thank you, Dennis and Tensie. God bless you on the other side of the coast. To Laurel and to Don Mosley and Hetty Zawatsky and all the people who shared. We really appreciate you coming on, and to all of you for participating. God bless everybody.
God bless.